This interview is part of the Oral History Project sponsored by the State Bar of New Mexico and its Senior Lawyers Division. I'm Sarah Bradley, a member of the Senior Lawyer Division of the State Bar. Today is January 10th, 2008, and I am interviewing Robert Taichert at his home in Albuquerque. Bob, is there anything about your childhood or your early adolescence that influenced the direction of your life?
Actually, my childhood was very much influenced by my father, who was a Lithuanian Jew, orphaned at 2 in a pogrom in Sudargas, Lithuania, brought to this country at the age of 11 by an older brother, speaking nothing but Yiddish and Russian. And we'll fast forward to, after some years, he went to Las Vegas, New Mexico, where his oldest brother lived, and he joined the National Guard, and he went chasing Pancho Villa with Pershing. A wonderful fool's mission. You can see a horse at 10 miles down in that part of the world. Anyway, Dad came out of the Army totally bilingual, and he ultimately he married my mother in Las Vegas, and they moved to Santa Fe and started the first 5 and 10 cent store. And I came along a little bit later. He was my inspiration. He taught me to fly fish when I was about 6 years old. And it's a passion. Actually, it's an addiction. It's a hopeless addiction. And with his limited education, formally, he was a voracious reader. He bought and read the Harvard Classics, all 5 feet. And he always wanted me to be a professional person. He didn't care whether I was a doctor or a lawyer, but I was going to be one or the other. And when I went to the University of New Mexico, well, life history in short, Dad and I were fishing on the Rio Grande near Pilar on December 7th of 41, and I'd shot a couple of mallards and we were headed back. And Dad turned on the radio and heard about the attack on Pearl Harbor, and he turned to his 13-year-old and he said, "Robert, you are leaving for New Mexico Military Institute as soon as they have a bed for you. You will serve your country as an officer." And that's the kind of inspiration he was. Well, anyway, I went to NMMI and then went to UNM and then went to Harvard Law School. And after my second year in Harvard Law School, the Santa Fe Draft Board decided I'd had my share of education and chased me into the Navy, which was the best possible thing that could have happened to me. It didn't take me long to get to Navy OCS in Newport. And near the end of that experience, my closest friend in law school, a wonderful lawyer named Jack Eastman, who had been my best friend in law school. His family adopted the cactus rat from New Mexico at Thanksgiving 1949 as just another one of their kids. And Jack got me a blind date to a formal dance honoring the class of 1952 at Harvard Law School. Well, I was the class of 1952, about to graduate from Navy OCS and go overseas. So Jack got me a blind date, and the lady who greeted you this morning walked across the hall in Severance Hall wearing a gorgeous pink formal and stepped up in front and said, "Hello, I'm Zany Bergen, and for me the war was over." So Zane and I were actually married on Guam, where I was posted. I was on a high naval staff that was just an intelligence and listening post. I was the only ensign on a staff of 67. So when I asked the chief of staff for whom I decoded messages daily, I was really privileged. I got to watch the Korean War from the top down, and got to watch Ho Chi Minh eject the French Inland Empire. And John Foster Dulles set the stage for the Vietnam War because he would not meet or treat with a man he called a communist. And even a 23-year-old ensign knew the Vietnamese had been fighting the Chinese and all comers for 1,000 years for their freedom. Well, that launched me in a lot of directions. Well, when I asked the chief if I could go to Long Island to marry Zane at her family home, he said, "Taichert, she's that gold bar, you're not going anywhere." So Zane and her mother, she was working for Vogue in New York at the time after her graduation from Wellesley in 52. And she quit her job, and she and her mother came, and my mother came, and we had a formal Navy wedding, starch whites, crossed swords, the whole business on Guam. And thus we were launched. When I got orders back to the States to catch a cruiser going west again, Zane had a wonderful job running the Guamanian office of a trading company. And she made enough money, about 3 times what I was as an ensign or a JG, and she took us on the Grand Tour of the Orient. And we visited Japan, Hong Kong, Bangkok, And we spent Christmas in Bangkok in 1953. So we have a love of travel. When we got back to New Mexico, my father died of a heart attack while I was overseas. So I found myself needing to be responsible for the running of 5 and 10 cent stores while I was 11,000 miles away. And when I got off active duty in May of 1955, Zane and I went back to Cambridge, and she went to the Harvard Business School while I finished law school. In 1956, we really didn't have much choice. We had to move to Santa Fe because I had to look after the family business as best I could. I didn't know anything, absolutely knew nothing. But together we managed the business until we sold it before we broke it, and then I could get on with the practice of law. I joined the Rhodes firm. Jack Eastham, meanwhile, had gone to Ropes Gray right out of law school, Boston's best law firm. His father was there before him. His father was one of Boston's most distinguished lawyers. And Jack's wife, to whom I introduced him on a blind date, her name was Hester Fuller before they married, persuaded Jack to talk to Pierce Rhodes, who had the Harvard firm of New Mexico. And Pierce Rhodes was a great man, but he was a bit pompous. I was talking to Dick Modrell, working on a deal some years later, and Dick said, "You know, Bob, Pierce Rhodes is the only man I ever saw who could strut sitting down." Well, anyway, Jack persuaded the Rhodes that I knew how to read and write, and so we moved here to Albuquerque in May of 1957, and we've been here ever since. The practice of law in the Rhodes firm was quite fascinating. When I went there, it was really a big firm. I was number 10, I think. And everyone did everything. So I'd be trying a negligence case one day and working on a mortgage financing for the First National Bank in Albuquerque the next. And it was kind of cold water. Rhodes believed in training you this way. They'd throw in the water, say, "Okay, let's see you swim." But it was wonderful training. And I tried a lot of lawsuits. I'd tried 11 or 12 jury cases to a verdict by the time I'd been in practice 5 years. And it was a lot of fun. And Rhodes led to some interesting paths. Vance Muan, who was practicing with Bob Botts, was then the chairman of the Board of Bar Examiners. And he got me involved, and I served on the Board of Bar Examiners for some years. And in the years when I was chairman, in the early 70s, I got sued 15 times, along with the other members of the Board of Bar Examiners, for alleged discrimination in the grading of the bar exam. And fortunately, New Mexico was the second state in the United States to adopt the multi-state bar exam. And since it's given simultaneously to applicants all over the country on the same day, it's kind of hard to discriminate. And
were these suits before the multi-state or after?
No, the suits were after we had the MBE installed. And Congress passed the Continuing Legal Education Opportunity Act. And law schools saw that as their cue to drag kids in because of their ethnicity, whether they were prepared for a professional education or not. And it happened all over the country. In one of the suits, there was a hearing before the New Mexico Supreme Court, and the chairman of the National Conference of Bar Examiners, retired dean of Missouri, a wonderful guy, asked me if I knew what a Black C was. And I obviously didn't. He said, "Well, Black C is, at the University of Michigan, thou shalt not give a black less than a C." And so these youngsters who were not prepared were victims. I thought, the dean of law school, I nearly had fisticuffs one time because I thought they were taking money from these kids by fraud. They were telling them they were doing fine, and the kids were simply at too low a level to catch a professional level education at the same pace that their peers did. And it was an awful tragedy. Many wonderful young people had their hearts broken. Well, the professors in law school are telling you, "You're doing fine, you're doing fine." And then all of a sudden, they fail a bar exam. And there was a lot of ethnic strife of sort in those days. Like, well, it must be the bar examiners. Well, they were 0 for 15. One of the cases went to the U.S. Supreme Court. In none of them were we found to discriminate. Through some chance of fate, because we're just a bunch of practicing lawyers. We'd buy questions from New York and Illinois and California, all the big states that could pay question drafters, and we'd dumb the questions down to where there were only 3 or 4 issues, because all we wanted to know is if these kids could make a noise like a lawyer. Were they not a peril to turn loose on the public? This was not exclusory at all. And in one of the hearings, I learned, to my great amazement, that New Mexico had the highest correlation between the grades on our essay test and the grades on most state bar exam. Well, that made it rather easy for judges to say, no, you're not being discriminated in the grading of the bar exam. Well, that led to other things. In 1971, Jackson Aiken, a senior partner, was negotiating with Don Dickinson the terms of Dickinson's retirement. And I had a cartoon in my head. And on Dickinson's side is, if it weren't for me, these guys would be pumping gas. How are they going to show their gratitude? Don was very rich and not very generous. And the guy on the other side was Jackson Aiken. The bubble over his head was, how much do I have to pay this old devil to get him to go away? So I decided to incorporate the Rhodes law firm so that people's retirement could be funded as they went along, and to eliminate this god-awful breakdown of an affectionate relationship into what turned out to be very nasty. So in 1971, looking a little bit like Fearless Fosdick of Dick Tracy fame, with bullet holes from the front and the back, I got the Rhodes firm incorporated. In 1972, put in it was called a 50% cash option profit sharing plan. They now call it 401ks. And well, it was very successful. I did all the employee benefits for the Rhodes firm, and while I was there, I had some wonderful trial experiences. I want to mention a couple of cases. As you know, young lawyers in the larger firms, 10 lawyers, were picked by the federal and state court judges to defend the indigent. And Bill Kitts was a wonderful lawyer who was called to chambers by Judge Hatch, Carl Hatch. When Kitts got out of law school, he clerked for Hatch, and Hatch had great respect for him. And Hatch called him in and said, I want you to defend a multiple murder on an Indian reservation case. He said, it's the worst crime I've ever seen, and you can have anyone you want. By the grace of God, Bill picked me. And we had an interesting time, let me put it that way. We tried that case, this has got to be 35 years ago, and we tried that case for 11 days. That was a long criminal trial in federal court. And it's fascinating. I am writing an autobiography, and I may even try to turn that into a story because it had everything. When we met our client, actually there was a conflict between our client and his cohort, so Al Montoya represented the other guy, and we did all the work, which was just fine. They were in their underwear in solitary. And the FBI, of course, had a god-awful confession, which was read to the jury. And during the trial, I was trying to cross-examine an FBI agent as to the voluntariness of these confessions. And I asked him to explain how, if it's voluntary, they took it from a man who'd been in solitary confinement in his underwear for 3 days. At that point, a voice boomed down from the bench. It's Judge Hatch, who was a family friend and had known me, kind of. And he said, Mr. Taichert, if you persist in this line of questioning, I'm going to have to show the jury that clothing. That clothing was the bloody clothing taken off these guys. The FBI lab screwed up, and they couldn't match the blood to the victims. Don't ask me why, but fortunately they did. And so when Joe Ryan, the prosecuting assistant U.S. attorney, tried to get him in, I went steaming up to the bench with Kitts, and we said, Mr. Ryan is just trying to prejudice the jury. He knows they can't tie that clothing to the defendants. And Hatch said, is that true, Mr. Ryan? And Joe admitted it was, and he said, well, you can't get that in evidence. So when I was working on the FBI agent, Hatch then said, if I persisted, he was going to show the jury that clothing and pointed to it. And Kitts and I immediately went up to the bench and moved for mistrial. And Hatch looked puzzled. He said, "Mr. Taichert, I was just trying to help you." Well, in the picking of the jury, there was one very appealing elderly Jewish salesman from New York who was in the panel. And Hatch voir dired each one of them. In a proper case, could you bring in the death penalty? And this man's answer was, "Your Honor, it has never been my lot in life to decide if another human being should live or die, so I would have to consider it." Hatch excused him for cause, and we moved for mistrial. That was turned out. Well, in the event, after a long and fascinating trial, the jury came in with a recommendation of clemency. One night, Kitts and I were researching at the law school. Zane and I lived near there, and we were having a beer, and we did scientific jury research. What kind of a jury do we think we can persuade not to kill these kids? And we decided, in our infinite wisdom, none of us ever knew how, that we wanted as many middle-aged WASP housewives as we could get on the jury. And there were 3. We later learned that on the question of first-degree murder, 12-zip. Death, 9-3, 9-3, 9-3. And they finally came in with a recommendation of clemency. So Judge Hatch was outraged. This is 10:30 at night. And so he pulled you, "Is this your verdict? Is this your verdict?" and so forth. And then he thanked them graciously and let them go. And Bill and I were packing up our books, and we were going to go have a drink. We were so elated that they weren't going to fry. And a voice boomed down from the bench. It's Judge Hatch again. He said, "You two should be ashamed of yourselves. If I ever saw a case where the death penalty is the only proper penalty, this was it." Then he caught himself and he realized what he'd done. Bill and I were ready to cry. And he said, "Forgive me, gentlemen, I was way out of line." He called us into chambers and he said, "Let me tell you, this is the worst case I ever saw, and you two won it." So Bill and I were so drained at that point, we just went home and went to bed. But fascinating case. Anyway, along the line, because when I incorporated the Rhodes firm at 35 lawyers, it was the biggest in the United States, I found myself chairman of the Professional Corporations Committee at the ABA tax section. And that...
Bob, can I stop you just a second?
Sure.
Back when you did this criminal trial, that was when you were appointed pro bono, wasn't it?
Oh, sure, it was all pro bono.
So you had a death penalty pro bono case.
Yeah, had several of those. I mean, to write about all of them. It did teach me the most important lesson a lawyer can learn, I think, in any criminal case. Your job is to make the prosecution prove their case. Whether they are, quote, guilty or not is not your call. What our Constitution requires is that people get a fair trial. And as defense counsel, our job was to see if they got a fair trial. We did not engage in the kind of nonsense that's gone on for years now with playing to the press and all that. But you learn that the Constitution means whatever these people are accused of doing, and they may have done it, most of ours had, they're entitled to fair trial. So that was a very important lesson in constitutional law to me.
And I gather the Rhodes firm supported the pro bono work that was required?
Well, let me put it this way. Don Dixon was pretty tight, but he didn't cut my pay, which wasn't very much. Well, I also was very lucky. I took a seminar in medical legal problems my third year at Harvard, taught by a guy named Bob Hamlin that I met before I went off to the Navy when he was a first-year student, I think. He was a physician. He was the head of the public health department of the town of Brookline, Massachusetts. He was writing a report for the Hoover Commission and going to law school at the same time. Well, he put this seminar together while I was off on the bounding main. And so when I came back, I took it just because I had such respect for him. When I got to the Rhodes firm, they had a whole bunch of malpractice cases, and I got thrown into those, and I was ungodly lucky. I got summary judgment in a half a dozen cases that set the basic framework of New Mexico malpractice law, which exists to this day. And
is that what helped formulate what's now the malpractice
well, I get to the
jury
Malpractice
instructions?
Act. Yes. Yeah, you had to have an expert witness to get to a jury in a case against a doctor. And a woman sued an obstetrician for leaving a sponge in her belly 6 years before. And I should be ashamed of myself, but I got the doctor off in that case. I even forget what it was about. There was no automatic liability in hospital hepatitis case. So really, there was a lot of that, and I really enjoyed it. I have a touch for medicine. And that led to my being involved with the university, excuse me, helping to put the medical school together. And in 1965, the dean of the medical school, a very bright pathologist named Bob Stone, sent the medical director, County Commissioner Willis Smith, to whom this state owes an enormous gratitude that they've never paid, and me around to look at public hospitals which had or which had not gotten a medical school in the Act. And we traveled all over the country. We looked at a lot of them. And the worst case we found was Salt Lake City. Of course, the church is a big factor there. And the county had a pest house that the university was not involved in. It was a dumping ground for patients who didn't have money. And so the church got mad, went up on the hill, and built that wonderful University of Utah Medical School. The best case we saw was in Seattle, where the King County Harborview Hospital is run by the University of Washington Medical School, and the Washington legislature supports it handsomely on the express condition that it be operated by the University of Washington Medical School. So we got back here, and fortunately Willis, he was the controlling vote on the county commission. Two of them were fraternity brothers of mine, Willis and Ed Balcom, and I don't even know who the other guy was, but Willis persuaded them that the only thing to do with this hospital to have for the good of the state was to turn over the university. So I had the privilege of negotiating the lease of the old Bernalillo County Medical Center to become the University Hospital, and the lease is still in effect. I'm really thrilled about that. And something else that Willis supported was that the county would continue to raise the mill levy so there would be money to keep this hospital doors open. Willis also, with a guy named Brasher, founded TBI, and the public has never thanked him adequately. Willis is in his 80s and he's in very poor health, but that was a lot of fun. And that led, I guess the Santa Fe Opera comes in at this point.
Well, while we're on the medical school, weren't you also involved in the medical legal panel?
Yeah, actually, I was on the Joint Committee of the State Bar and the State Medical Society that created the medical legal panel. And I'd forgotten that in those days, the plaintiff's lawyers and the defense lawyers were friends. And we had respect with each other. And we communicated. And I guess I was kind of the lead. What the plaintiff's lawyers wanted was assurance that they could get an expert witness against the doctor. The doctors had a terrible conspiracy of silence. And the way we got around that was to persuade the State Medical Society that if this panel we were going to create, it followed the Pima County, Arizona plan. We didn't invent it. It was second. That the Medical Society would draft a doctor to consult with and testify for a plaintiff who was found to be entitled to who had a jury issue of negligence by the panel. And what the docs wanted, we got, which was that in the event the panel decided against the patient, the lawyer for that claimant would not file suit except in extraordinary circumstances, a paraplegia or brain damage or something where they're just going to go to court, and this was a discovery thing. So that worked really very well. It's worked less well since the legislature got involved, but it was a good thing. I think we did that, about 1965? Heaven help us. In 1975, all the malpractice carriers pulled out of New Mexico. And at that point, I was general counsel for Presbyterian. And Dick Barr and the Medical Society asked me to help draft the Malpractice Act. And so working with Bill Kitts, who'd become a plaintiff's lawyer, and Dick Ransom and some other wonderful guys, we drafted the Malpractice Act. And the problem in New Mexico at that time, since there was no insurance, was plaintiffs had no place to recover except from the doc's house pocket savings. And from the plaintiff's standpoint, is how are we going to recover in a proper case? And New Mexico was very small. So we looked around the country and found some malpractice acts that we kind of liked. Michigan, I think, was our example. They had $6,500 covered by the mutual. We'll get to the New Mexico Physician Mutual when we're through. We all agreed there had to be a limit on pain and suffering, and that's where the $500,000 ceiling came in. And we also all agreed, just as citizens, that there should be unlimited recovery of medical expenses. So that's still in the Act. And then plaintiffs' lawyers and I and one of the partners in Montgomery and Andrews lobbied the thing through the legislature. The legislature wanted people to have a place to recover. And so we got this act passed. Well, then we formed, I actually incorporated New Mexico Physician Mutual Liability Company. I was its general counsel. And that was a wonderful experience. At about the same time, when the Travelers pulled out, they told my good client Presbyterian, we will give you $1 million single limit policy if you'll give us $1 million to hold sort of for fun for the year. So Ray Woodham, brilliant administrator of the Presbyterian system, sent Dick Barr and me off to Hamilton, Bermuda with other major hospital systems to form the multi-mutual hospital liability company. And there were enough lives covered that with premiums you could survive. It worked. And the New Mexico Malpractice Act made it possible to persuade the malpractice carriers to come back in New Mexico, and they're still here. So that was a good thing. And I hope this isn't a James Joycean stream of consciousness. I'm just trying to remember some things as we go along.
Well, that's why I interjected the thing about the medical malpractice, because I knew that you'd been involved in that.
Well, I guess I was up to my ears and loved it. And it was a service, and I'm happy about that service. I want to talk about Presbyterian for just a second because the Santa Fe Opera plays a role there. When Zane and I moved to Santa Fe so I could run the family business in 1956, I was fingered by Tom Catron, who was my family's lawyer as well as John Crosby's lawyer, to come to lunch with John. Actually, we met John at a fiesta party. And Zane saw this forlorn-looking character hiding behind a tree by himself. So she went over and introduced herself and tried to make friends. It was John Crosby. And a week later, I got a phone call from Tom Catron inviting me to have lunch with Crosby and 3 businessmen I'd never met.
Okay, just for edification, who is John Crosby?
Oh, I'm sorry. John Crosby was the genius who started the Santa Fe Opera. He started and made it live. He was the best money raiser we had, and he created an international phenomenon. Well, I'd known John Crosby from Adam, and he didn't know me except that my family was prominent in Santa Fe and they supported the arts. So went to lunch with John, and he told us that he had envisioned that Santa Fe was the proper place to start a world-class summer repertory opera company. And John was very wealthy. His father was a senior partner in Sullivan & Cromwell and ran the Cuban sugar interest before Batista got overthrown. And he had bought the San Juan Ranch and hired an acoustician from Boston to come out, and they fired rifle shots all around the hills to pick the best place acoustically for an opera theater. And that's where the theater is today. And John told us what his vision was, and I knew nothing about opera. The other guys may have known something. There was a businessman, a Los Alamos scientist, a brilliant acoustical engineer named Ben Sanders, who knew everything, and me, and Crosby, and Catron. And so John said he had this vision, and that he had picked out the site, and he would build the theater with his own money. And would we please form a nonprofit corporation called the Santa Fe Opera and raise $90,000 so they could survive the first season. And so Tom Catron wrote the articles, and We signed, and then we had the first meeting of the corporation. And all the others decided that I should be president because I had lots of time. And so the first president of Santa Fe Opera was a 28-year-old rookie lawyer who just passed the bar exam, was looking for a job, had a pregnant wife, and no visible means of support.
But plenty of time.
Yeah, lots of time. Running a 5 and 10 cent chain on the side. Well, there were a lot of naysayers in Santa Fe who said, for God's sake, you can't have an opera company here. And all of us canvassed the town. We found some of the leading citizens. And John he could charm the rattles off a snake. So we had a good board by the time the season opened on July the 3rd of 1957. I remember that because we were there for Butterfly. And we have a towel from that performance. And what a thrill it was for us 50 years later to attend the opening night of Carmen. And I must say, people were very kind to me, and all these young opera singers would come up and give me a kiss and thank me. Well, really, all I did was carry a spear in the chorus of Aida. John Crosby was the genius who made it all happen. But in that first year, $90,000 was a lot of money in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Well, a Uranian promoter named Andrei Senyutovich, who came on our board, gave us a boatload of penny uranium stock. And we sold it for $60,000, and it saved the day. So the first season was launched, and the rest kind of is history. And it's been a love all my life. I have served on the board for 17 years and then resigned, and about a year ago, I was asked to give a talk about the early days to a meeting of the board, and they put me back on the board as an honorary member, and I'm really thrilled. I go to their meetings and have a lot of fun. Let me contrast that $90,000 and this rookie lawyer as your first president with Susan Miller, who is a magnificent president. Her husband, Bill, is a retired senior partner in Lehman Brothers who cashed out. They're preposterously wealthy, but she is a wonderful woman and a superb executive. Well, the opera budget on the 50th anniversary year was $15 million, and the season was sold out. We have a 1,200-seat house. They put on 36 performances, and there were 6 seats unsold for the whole season. And people are coming from all over the world. It's just a magnificent, magnificent thing. And I'm just I am proud of having had a little hand in that. And I did incorporate the opera guilds, which now help to support them. So that's the opera story. And in local terms, I got involved with the symphony about 1965, and the first time I was president was 1969. And the last time was 1991. Somehow or other I was called upon as a fireman when they were about to go broke. And the New Mexico Symphony is a superb orchestra. We're talking in 2008. It has been a labor of love for the musicians and for the board and for the community all these years. And I think that what I brought to the table was a love of music and of the musicians and a determination to help them improve their lot. Most of them teach school to make a living. We don't pay them half what they should be paid. And I shouldn't say we, I'm not on the board anymore, but the board and some others are trying to get the community to realize that we have a $5 million budget, we need a $10 million budget, and we need a $50 million endowment. And I hope to God that they'll get it, because it's really worthy. And the New Mexico Symphony takes music into the schools all over the state. You know, we don't have music education in schools anymore. Some bureaucrat is saving money to pay teachers to not work. The wonderful teachers get frustrated because it is a bureaucratic system. That's a separate subject that needs a lot of attention. So anyway, along the way, about 1980, I guess, I was elected to the House of Delegates of the American Bar Association and served that for a couple of years. And while I was chairman of the Professional Corporations Committee of the ABA tax section, we thought there should be an American College of Tax Counsel. So I was a regent, one of the people who formed it. And I'm still a fellow of that. A lot of my practice was really tax-oriented. I tried cases because I had to. My love was business work, putting things together instead of taking them apart, keeping people out of trouble instead of getting them out of trouble. In 1984, I had a serious illness, and I had been taking steroids, and I now, looking back, realized that I was suffering from what's called a steroid psychosis. I quit the roadie firm and accepted a partnership in a large Phoenix firm, Lewis and Roca, and I was a terrible misfit there. Now, I'm interested in service. I'm not interested in money. They're interested in money. I'm not interested in service. And so it was a terrible fit, and my health was just awful. I had a gut ailment that very nearly killed me, and when I was going downhill, they finally sent me to the Mayo Clinic, and a world-class surgeon invented the procedure that he did on me, and he gave me back my life. So my gut works like yours, it's just 8 feet shorter. But after Zane and I were in Phoenix for 5 years. During those 5 years, Zane went back to horses. She was a brilliant horsewoman as a kid and was invited to ride in the National Horse Show when she was 15. And when we were here, we didn't have enough money for horses and so forth. And sometime in the late 70s, a very rich Argentinian, member of the Thyssen family, engaged me as local counsel for him to buy a huge ranch. And he only had 3 gorgeous Argentine model wives while I represented him. And he liked Zane a lot. Well, before the Arabian horse bubble burst, this fellow, who's a graduate of the London School of Economics, said it's going to go south and I'm going to sell out. He pastures 18,000 head of cattle in Latin America. And the Thyssen's, Fritz Thyssen was Adolf Hitler's armorer until Adolf took after the Jews. Fritz went to prison, and he turned up in Buenos Aires. And today, of course, ThyssenKrupp is the biggest industrial empire in Germany, so some things didn't change. Well, when Federico decided to sell the breeding farm in Ocala, Florida, I went down. I hired a good real estate lawyer down there. We went down to close the deal. We were riding around looking at this gorgeous place with wonderful horses. He'd had me buy his breeding stock. I once paid $500,000 for a half a stallion. I told Federico, I hope we bought the right half. But anyway, we were riding around. He said, Bob, he thought Zane was awful cute. And actually, we were quite good friends. He said, Bob, you need to get a couple of these horses for Zane. And I thanked him profusely. I said, you know, Federico, I am a middle-class lawyer in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I bought your breeding stock. I know what these things cost. So a week after we closed that sale, Zane got a phone call from the farm manager who asked her where he was to deliver her 2 Arabians. The guy gave Zane a gelding and a stallion. And that changed our lives immediately. All of a sudden we had 2 two-year-old baby Arabians, and Zane was just in heaven. If I may divert to what really is responsible for my success more than anyone else, it's my wife, Zane. She got her bachelor's at Wellesley, as I said. She went to Harvard Business School. They had a 1-year program for girls. They would not let women have a degree in 1955. And she and her classmates and some of the others raised such hell that the next year they admit them on degrees. Well, 1 year was all I had, so 1 year was fine for her. Then she came out here. We had 2 kids, and she got a master's and a PhD in English, which is her first love, and became an English professor at UNM. 1 year, Peter White was then teaching freshman composition. He went on to be vice provost of the university. He took a sabbatical to go to Poland for a year, and Zane was the only person in the department willing to take on teaching technical writing in the College of Engineering. So she went to MIT and spent a summer learning how to do that, and brought me home a loving spouse's gift called the Techno Peasant's Survival Manual. I still have it. Well, she was teaching in engineering and in English and giving tests. They had to flush out kids who had no hope of doing college-level work, and she ran that program as assistant director of freshman. God knows what all she did. But one day the phone rang, and Sandia Corporation proceeded to engage her as a technical writer in the particle beam fusion facility and doubled her pay. So she did that for 4 years. Well, when the invitation came to me to go to Phoenix, Zane had always wanted to do dressage. And we had these 2 baby Arabians, and so together we made the bad judgment to go to Phoenix. But she did a lot of dressage and showed all over the country while she was out there, and so that was a good thing. But in 1989, after my life-saving surgery, we got green cards and came home to New Mexico, and that's where we are.
Well, I know that you travel to South America a lot. Is that
a lot.
tied to this?
Well, in a way it is. Part of it's microenterprise. There's an organization called Acción, Spanish word for action, international. In the Peace Corps days, some idealistic young New Yorkers who were wealthy borrowed a little money to go to the least corrupt place they then knew, that was Caracas. And so they went down there and they thought, well, we'll build sewers and streets and so forth. And they looked around and talked to people, and they discovered the problem was people did not have a way to make a living. And so they, somehow or other, and I don't know the details, they started making microloans. A little bit of money, $25, $30. These people had nothing. They had no savings, they had no money, they had no capital, they couldn't get in the bank. And so they started doing micro-lending. And Acción International will fast forward to, I guess about 1989 or 90. At that point, Acción International had operations in 14 Latin American countries. 8 of those programs were self-supporting. At bank rates, they were lending to descamisados, very poor people who had character and ambition and no money. And it's been such a success that when I was kind of drafted to put together an Acción in the United States, to be part of that, we traveled all over Latin America. And Zane went with me. We went to Argentina and Paraguay and Bolivia and Argentina and a whole bunch of places. And came back, and the board of Acción International decided that they wanted to start a similar program in the United States in spite of great societal differences. We have a safety net, we have bankruptcy laws, we have credit card companies, and we thought that if it worked at all, it would be hard to make it self-sustaining. It's got to operate at a profit or it can't survive. And we thought we were looking at about a 9% loss ratio. Well, Acción decided that the places they wanted to start were those which had large, poor Hispanic populations. So they picked San Diego, Albuquerque, San Antonio, Chicago, and New York. And working with Anne Haynes Yatzkowitz, who is still the president, a brilliant woman, and Roberto Espat, Rhodes' Southwest Papers, I put Acción together, and we began to build the board. And Penny Remby, wonderful citizen, had a dinner one night to help us get off the ground. A man named Joe Jacobs of Jacobs Engineering, $11 billion a year around the world, was a kind of our patron saint. And Joe came to that dinner and he said, I will give you $150,000 if you can raise $150,000 in Albuquerque, New Mexico in the next 30 days. We all gulped and practically choked. Larry Willard of Wells Fargo stood up and said, I pledge $35,000 tonight. And we raised $150,000. So we started with $300,000 capital. And what we discovered, Ann Haynes had participated in a survey of the South Valley of Albuquerque, thinking this is our market, that's the market in Latin America. When we got launched, we discovered that our market mirrors the image of the city. We have all ethnic groups. We have the same percentage of women borrowers as men borrowers. 40% of the borrowers are women, or it may be 60. I've been out of it for a few years, but it has made societal change. And Acción New Mexico started in Albuquerque, then moved to Santa Fe. Now it's all over the state. And Ann devised a scheme so that all of the branches of Wells Fargo close the loans and receive the payments. And so they've been able to spread the net. And the people, we've got all kinds of borrowers. And the loss ratio for Acción New Mexico has never been over 3%. And the loss ratio for Latin America has never exceeded 1.5%. So the big New York banks shove money at Acción International because this character lending in Latin America is safer than asset-based lending in the United States. And so the banks paid to lug us around Latin America. And also my passion for fishing has caused me to go down there to fish in Patagonia, and with a retired doctor friend, Livy Parsons, we've gone all the way to the tip of Argentina to fish for sea-run brown trout. Fly fishing in a 30-knot wind with a 14-foot-long fly rod trying to entice these things. Well, perfectly normal brown trout from Vermont were planted there, about a foot long, foot and a half long. There wasn't enough to eat in the river, so they went to sea. And by going to sea, they got very big. The largest I ever landed was 20 pounds. That's a big trout.
That's a
so
big trout.
We did a lot of fishing trips down there.
Well, you're also multilingual, are you not?
Yeah, I'm fluent in Spanish. I'm not multi, solamente dos. No, bilingual.
Did you get that from your father?
Well, actually, when I was a kid in Santa Fe, in the 30s, 65% of the people spoke only Spanish unless they had to speak English. I know what discrimination is because 35% of the people in Santa Fe were not Hispanic. And the way I tell people is if you're a green-eyed kid in Santa Fe in the 30s, you had to be bilingual if you wanted to survive to puberty. And then I'm ashamed of myself because I let it go. I didn't use Spanish much until I got involved with Acción. So then Zane and I went to Antigua, Guatemala to a wonderful language school 10 years ago. 30 days, one-on-one, 7 hours a day in class, 2 hours of homework every night, and a writing assignment over every weekend. And these guys were real pushovers. One of my teachers had me read a short story by Cervantes called La Fuerza de la Sangre, The Power of the Blood, and rewrite the ending over a weekend because he thought it was illogical. I mean, a rich young man raped a gorgeous young woman, and her son was run over by a horse, and there's a little tiny kid lay in the street, and this guy's father saw the kid and took him in and so forth. And it ended up that the rapist asked the woman he raped to marry him. And she did. And my professor said, "That's illogical. She should have killed him. Go rewrite the story." So anyway, it was a wonderful experience. And since then, I've been able to interpret, read, write in Spanish, and speak it every chance I get. It's a beautiful language, and I wish I hadn't let all those years go by. Is there more to tell? I don't know.
Yeah, why don't we take a quick break here? Because, yeah, there's... Bob, speaking of your fluency in Spanish, weren't you also involved in the U.S. foundation of the University of the Valley of Guatemala and Sandia Preparatory School,
well, yeah.
Which is a mouthful?
Well, Sandia Prep is easier, and it's much earlier, so I'll talk about that. I was on the board of Sandia Prep for 8 years in the 70s. Served as president of that board for several years. It's a wonderful school, and part of it was hilarious. Barbara Sims was on our board, and Albert Sims was on the academy board. And in my infinite wisdom, I thought, this school's going broke. We've got to get the academy to adopt us. So, of course, we'd talk about that, and then Albert and Barbara would talk about it at home, and nothing ever got done. But the school survived. Sue Whitfield, a wonderful woman from Houston with homes in Santa Fe and Albuquerque and Houston. There was a family foundation that helped us to keep the place alive, and it was wonderful fun. The University of the Valley of Guatemala it's a fishing story. It starts with fishing. I was in a fly fishing tournament at Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and I met Tom Strook, who was the U.S. ambassador to Guatemala during the Bush senior years. He and Bush were classmates at Yale, and I liked Tom, and the president of the board, Tom had retired. He's even older than I am. A guy named Berkeley Cohn and I had a drink, and they said, you know, we don't have a lawyer on the board. We need you. So I looked at it, and the next thing I knew, I was a director of the U.S. Foundation of the University of Isla Guatemala. Well, that school is remarkable. It's a non-sectarian, non-profit, private university that is owned and controlled by a board of trustees of Guatemalans. This foundation was set, it's 45 years old today. The foundation was set up 25 years ago, mostly to shepherd grants from USAID to see that they got out of the country and got into the hands of the trustees and not into the pockets of the Guatemalan politicians. So I went on that board, and I'm afraid I'm kind of a change agent. I thought it's preposterous for these rich Easterners. They're mostly, they call themselves the Eastern Mafia. They were people either from Guatemala or with major economic interest in Guatemala, all very wealthy. And when they conned me into joining the board, they said, you know, there's very little to do. All you got to do is to make sure that the money goes from Washington to Guatemala, and you try to get some more out of the feds. And the Guatemalans are so unbelievably poor, and they need education. It's the only way for anyone to get out of a hole. The gap between the rich and poor in Guatemala is unbelievable. You have the Mayans in the hills who don't know how to read or write or anything else. You've got the rich folks in Guatemala City who've got their Lear jets and they fly down to the Rio Dulce for the weekend or wherever they choose to go, and the poor people who maintain the crops that make them stay rich are not even on the radar. So we had one of the mega rich people of Guatemala on the board, and I sort of beat the drum the 5 years I served on that board. You've got to become a major money raiser. I misspoke. John Crosby used to tell us on the board of the Santa Fe Opera, your job as directors is to give, get, or get off. And I put it that bluntly to these people. Well, finally I got frustrated and retired, and so I went emeritus a couple of years ago. But it was a lot of fun. We had board meetings in Guatemala once a year, and it's a wonderful school. They turn out more engineers than any other school in Guatemala. And now they're supporting teachers to teach the Mayan children Spanish as a second language, so they're not locked into their language that is only spoken by the Mayan Indians. And it's really very thrilling to see these kids prosper. When the Civil War ended in Guatemala, about I've forgotten the exact year, 90-something or other, the Guatemalan government gave to this school the old army base in the highlands at a place called Sololá. And it was the base from which the Guatemalan army killed an awful lot of indigenous people, men, women, and children. And today it is a thriving campus, educating people. And I attended the first graduating class from college at that place. And there wasn't a dry eye in the place, including me. You see these kids having been educated, taken out of the poor. And I'll tell you how poor Guatemala is. The school can train a teacher for something like $250 a year. And we have things like, there was one beautiful young woman who always came dressed as a widow. She was a gorgeous woman, maybe in her early 20s. And finally the rector of the school asked her why she always wore this widow's garment. It was because she had to hitchhike from her home many miles away, and it took her 2 days to get to school, and she could sleep in mortuaries or churches on her way there. That's how poor these people are. So it grabs your heart. And I found that I was just too busy with other things. Along the way, I got involved with Samaritan Counseling Service, which is a wonderful organization in Albuquerque that provides the best, most cost-effective psychological counseling that you can get anywhere. They charge less than $100 an hour, I think. And it's a wonderful cause. And I served that board for about 5 years. never was chairman, but it's just a wonderful cause, and I enjoyed it very much. And what else is there? Well, I did serve the Supreme Court as chairman of the disciplinary board for a while.
And weren't you also one of the original people involved in judicial selection?
Well, yes, as a matter of fact, that's an ancient story, and I wish it still existed. When I was a young lawyer, the governors, this goes back a long way, would ask the Judiciary Committee of the State Bar to recommend at least 2 lawyers, one from each party, in any community where a vacancy existed, as the best qualified lawyers to approach to see if they would accept a judgeship. And I was the junior officer present, but I worked with names that many lawyers will know: Bob Botts and Joe Rail, George Reese, LaFell Oman. These were all wonderful people. And as I was the junior, I usually had the task of tracking down the best lawyers in the town. They knew them, of course, and I was just trying to find out about them. And that committee was like litmus paper. There wasn't any political nonsense. And the governors had a perfect out, as governors would today if they weren't so political. If someone approached a governor for a job, he would say, if you are on the list that this Judiciary Committee submits to me, I will consider you. And that was the end of that. They didn't have to worry about it. And then, well, I'm sorry we lost that system, because the so-called Missouri plan that New Mexico adopted is not the Missouri plan. It had a little extra windage for political purposes. The Missouri plan, the Judicial Selection Committee goes through a process a lot like ours here in New Mexico, and they submit a list to the governor, and the governor must select the judge from that list. In New Mexico, if the governor doesn't find the right politician on the list, he sends it back. And the effect of that on the quality of the judiciary in New Mexico has been devastating. I have found a terrible deterioration in the quality of justice of state court judges. We have some wonderful judges, people like Linda Vance and our presiding judge, and there are some good judges everywhere. But you talk to the lawyers who try cases in Santa Fe, and they say, if you can get Jim Hall, fine. If you can't, you better try to disqualify all you can. And you know, it's become a political job. And so you get every job seeker who's not making a living as a lawyer and may not know much, who becomes a judge. And I worry about the quality of justice administered by people who don't know any law and are politically inclined. That's a bad thing. And I wish that we hadn't, quote, progressed to where the legislature gave us a system that is politically tainted. And you know, well, the Greek philosopher Heraclitus said the citizens should protect the law as he would the gates of the city. That is the bulwark of our freedom. And so I urge all the lawyers I talk to, try to get a genuine merit selection system in this state. I don't mean to disparage those who I consider unqualified, but the level of the judiciary, the level of the top remains great. You get people like Dick Bosson and Ed Sanchez, and you got wonderful judges. Wait, I think I misspoke his last name.
Ed Chavez.
It's Ed Chavez and Pam Minsner. They're really smart. They're really good judges. And the top is fine. It's the level of the bottom of the judiciary that is poor. And I'm glad I'm not trying cases anymore, because I probably wouldn't dare go into any court. The federal judges remain of high caliber. So that's my little political speech. I do think the lawyers in New Mexico really need to focus on improving our selection process to eliminate those who are just job seekers with no skills and find the best qualified lawyers, whatever the system is, in a given community who would consider a judgeship if asked. That was the question the Judiciary Committee would put to them. And once we gave the names to the governor, we were out of the loop.
Other groups that you became directly involved with because of the type of practice you had was a I guess the colloquial was called the group.
Oh, well, in
What was that?
1973 or so, a bunch of tax lawyers met in Washington. It was shortly after, no, ERISA was passed in 74, and it was called Every Ridiculous Idea Since Adam, and I want to come back to that in a minute. In fact, let me finish that thought now. It was sold as the way to protect employees from having their employers either steal or lose their retirement money. And in recent years, we've seen all these companies that are canceling their plans. It turns out, I don't know historically, but I was invited to the first Airlie House conference after that thing was passed. We were all trying to understand it. That it really was a sellout to big business, because ERISA does not require employers to fund currently their pension obligations. It permitted employers to accrue the obligation. I promise you now, I'll pay you later, if you will. And so the employers just didn't make the contributions. So the money for the retirement is not in trust. And that was another sellout by Congress to big business. And I abhor it. It is a terrible societal disaster created by Congress letting employers accrue. Just make an entry in the books. We owe this much to the plan this year, but you don't have to put it in trust. And that's a damn disgrace.
Well, did this group that you were involved with...
Oh, the group. Well, sorry, I got diverted a little bit because I get pretty hot under the collar about the way pension reform has not been. A bunch of us who were at that session got together and decided we need to have an organization of tax lawyers around the country who can communicate with each other and share information, help find a good lawyer in a town. So there were about 50 when we organized it. I was one of the organizers in, I don't know, about 1974 maybe. And today the group is a very structured organization nationwide of tax lawyers, between 500 and 800. And so if you have a client who has a problem in any part of the country, you know these people are all carefully screened. They are vetted, and they have to be recommended by 2 members of the group, and no application goes forward unless at least 1 member of the board of directors knows that applicant. So it's very selective, and it is the most wonderful network of tax lawyers. You need help, you know where to find it. An outgrowth of that was the Small Business Council of America, which I also have been involved with, though I'm now emeritus. It was created as a lobbying arm of the group. And what we would do is always at our expense. No one ever paid us. We'd go lobby Congress to try to keep the socialists on the Joint Committee staff and the IRS and Justice from ruining the economy. I had a tax professor named Stanley Surrey at Harvard. Took an advanced course from him. And he was Assistant Secretary of Tax Policy. And he coined the phrase tax expenditure, which everyone accepts in Washington. If you lower taxes, that's a tax expenditure. In a free society where you own your own property and you voluntarily pay your tithe to the government to help support the government, there's no such thing as a tax expenditure. The alternative minimum tax, which was passed to catch some very rich folks when the Ford Foundation flew Bobby Kennedy to the West Coast, Congress was going to show them. And the fact is, the AMT never caught the group it was after. It has nailed the middle class. And I notice that the IRS is now whining, you can't take it away because that would cost us $31 million. It ain't their money. So that the group has been very, and I'm still involved with the group. I love them dearly. They're my very good friends. Excuse me. What else is there that I can think of? I've had a lot of fun. And in 1998, I do need to talk about the Mind Research Network. Am I ahead of the game?
Well, I was going to ask, you're now retired from the active practice of law?
I retired from the, quote, active practice of law, which is to say I simply moved my office. I've been involved with the American Arbitration Association, a fairly high-profile around the country for over 30 years. I'm on all their panels, and I've represented them when they need a lawyer in New Mexico. And I still do mediation and arbitration. I love it. It's a way to solve problems. I've published some articles on that. I finally came to my senses after 51 years and realized, I haven't needed money for a long time. We're not real rich, but we don't need money. And so the only reason I've practiced for the last 15 years is just for the fun of it. And now my heart belongs to the Mind Research Network, and I need to tell you a little bit about that.
Please.
Excuse me. Pete and Nancy Domenici have a schizophrenic daughter. And Pete tried for 20 years to get Congress' attention to the need to fund some basic research into mental illness. And in 1998, Senator Domenici and Leonard Napolitano, the retired dean of the medical school, I'd been his lawyer when he was dean, or the university's lawyer. And incidentally, his brilliant daughter Janet is the governor of Arizona, and I'd vote for her for president. Brilliant woman. Anyway, Leonard and Pete asked me to put together, as an independent nonprofit, it was first called the National Institute of Multiple Brain Imaging or something. The name was coined by a maniac, a brilliant scientist, but a nut from Los Alamos. It's gone through several iterations. Well, I put it together in '98, and Leonard Napolitano and Julie Weeks, then Vice President of Business Finance of UNM, and I basically ran it. We had interim executive directors. And in 2002, I'd been on the board 5 years, they hired someone who was recommended by the Domenicis. And Steve Bell promised me it's always a disaster when the Domenicis try to pick someone. The woman they picked to head the place was not a neuroscientist. She was arrogant, narcissistic, and irresponsible. So Julie Weeks fired her in 2005. And a wonderful woman named Gwyl Newman and her husband Bruce, she lost a son to schizophrenia, had a party at their home in Tesuque to honor Pete and Nancy in 2006 in the summer. And I was invited, I guess, for Old Lang Syne. And I walked in, and Pete gave me a hug and thanked me for coming. And Julie Weeks, by the time the meeting was over, persuaded me I needed to go back on the board, so I did. It is a major love. It is a mental illness research and development institution. It's not part of UNM, it's not part of anything. It's a 501c3 freestanding, and that's what Pete wanted, and God was he smart, because the politics of universities and other things would have ruined it. And the place was insolvent when John Razier, a brilliant electrical engineer, was named president. Julie found him. I don't know how she did, but he won early tenure when teaching at UNM for inventing a worldwide platform of great use to all universities. He then went into industry and made a lot of money doing that. Well, John Razier took over in January of 2006. And by the end of 2006, the deficit was gone. It was $5 million. They had $10 million in assets and $15 million in debts. He'd gotten rid of the debt. And he'd reduced the dependency on federal money to 90%. Earmarks are going to go away. And this year, 2007 ended, the dependency on federal money was reduced to 50%. We have $31 million in competitively achieved grants, and some of the best neuroscientists in the world are coming here. I'm particularly proud of three. Kent Keel and Vince Calhoun left Yale to come here to study psychopathy. What makes psychopaths, and what can you do about it? And part of their job is to scan the brains of prisoners. Well, we have one of the very few mobile MRIs in the world. And so Kent Keel has been able to do 200 people in the last year. And in New Haven, you'd have to have guards bring the prisoners in, and it'd take a very inefficient process. And Vince Calhoun is working on algorithms. Well, Kent Hutchison, who is probably the country's leading addiction researcher, left the University of Colorado to come here. So we have three of the most prominent people in their fields coming here. And today the Mind Research Network is studying addiction, schizophrenia, traumatic brain injury. We've got a major operation going on with the Defense Advanced Research called DARPA because we can help with traumatic brain injury to learn what it is and what you do about it. We're not clinical. We don't take care of sick people. We're trying to find out how to tell the docs how to take care of the sick people. Well, in September, Julie and our president, John Razor, asked me if I would meet with them, and I should have been suspicious but wasn't. But Julie said, okay, Buster, it's your turn. So I'm now chairman of the board. I became chairman of the board of the Mind Research Network in September. So I say I retired from the practice of law. The fact of the matter is that I'm almost full-time engaged in the work of the Mind Research Network. Going to Florida this weekend to meet some people at a major mental illness research organization that Will Newman, who's now on our board, founded in Florida years ago. So it's very exciting. And I'm doing that, and Zane and I are enjoying life in our home, and we travel a lot. I fish a lot. And I'm also trying to write an autobiography for the reasons that have become apparent while we talked about this.
Well, I want to know how you earn a top-notch reputation in your field of law, have all the community involvement that you've talked about this morning, and manage to sustain and have a thriving 50-plus year marriage.
Well, I tell people that Zane has a very high pain threshold. The truth is, my father instilled in me, and both parents did. My mother served in the Mexico legislature as a representative from Santa Fe County. And they were both very active in the community. And they taught me that, well, they weren't specific about lawyers. They knew lawyers, but not what lawyers have. We are given such gifts, such skills, dealing with people, analyzing problems, helping people. That service has always been a big part of my life. And I started to tell you how I came to be counsel for Presbyterian. That was very simple. I met Arthur Spiegel on the Santa Fe Opera Board. Art was the Spiegel mail order catalogs. Moved to Albuquerque years ago. Wonderful man. Well, he was chairman of the board of Presbyterian Hospital. And Dick Modrell, who had been on the board, retired from the board. And Ray Woodham told Spiegel he needed to find a new general counsel. And Spiegel said, well, why don't you take Taichert? And that is how, while I was a partner of the Rhodes firm, we started representing Presbyterian Hospital Center. And ultimately, it took 6 people to take care of all that. I couldn't possibly do it all alone, and I wasn't smart enough and didn't have enough time. So Gene Walton was my number 2. Gene ultimately went to Pres and unfortunately died of cancer. And now Diane Fisher, who was number 3, is their general counsel. So we started something really good for the community, as Presbyterian is a marvelous, marvelous institution. And I'm proud to have had a little place helping them.
Well, you've always struck me as someone who is incredibly friendly, always willing to take time to sit down and talk with someone about whatever their questions or concerns were. You seem so relaxed, but it seems like your life is so incredibly busy. How do you keep from just stressing out?
I think I have the disposition of a year-old Labrador. I go through life loving my fellow man, and I know what I know. I need to know what you know. I need to learn what you know. And it has served me well. It's served my clients well. When we're negotiating any kind of a contract, when I got to Lewis and Roca in Phoenix, and I was representing a buyer or a seller, I'd go to a brilliant technician. He'd say, well, what do you want, a buyer's contract or a seller's contract? And I consider those abhorrent. I want the contract to be profitable for my client and the other guy's client. And that's sort of what led me doing a lot of mediation arbitration last, because you try to find a meeting of the minds where both sides win. Brutal contracts always cause problems, whether it's a $100 contract or a $100 million contract. The parties can't get along. It's bad. Excuse me.
Do we need to stop so you can get some water?
I guess I'm all right. The path that I have taken has been very much affected by a determination to leave the world a little better than the way I found it. All of us, that's what can we do but try to leave it a little better for having passed this way. So I'm just a drop of sand on a big beach, but it's been a lot of fun. And I never got bored as a lawyer, which is why I didn't retire a lot of years sooner.
How would you say the legal profession or the legal community has changed in the years that you've been involved with it?
Well, while I've been blessed to have a kind of nationwide scope in the deals I've done with various people, the part of the legal practice that has bothered me a lot is the same thing that bothers us politically. People get personally involved and personally hostile over professional things that are simply professional tools. And the competence of the lawyers today I think is superb. I'm sure I couldn't get into Harvard Law School today. There were 3 women in the class of 52, of 478 entering. And of course, now it's either 25 or 30% of the class, and they were obviously smarter than all the rest of us. But I think that the quality of training of law schools generally is better than it was. People come out of law school knowing more than they did. I think those who get to clerk for a federal judge or clerk in a law firm get a much faster start. When I got my degree from Harvard, I looked at this piece of paper and said, now what do I do? And the clinical law programs like the one UNM pioneered and is now kind of a national standard have been very good. I do worry about the lust for money that seems to control people's lives. I closed a lot of deals in New York and Los Angeles and other big cities, and it would break my heart to see the partner I was working with reading the Wall Street Journal in a corner office while some brilliant kid was sitting in a broom closet writing the documents. You make a lot more money in those places. You trade money for lifestyle living here, and thanks God we've got this. For all our faults, New Mexico is a wonderful place to live. So my assessment of lawyers and judges is, by and large, they're better trained than I was or my generation was. You find exceptional judges. You know, I bemoan the way that we pick judges now because some of the poorer ones are not qualified, but the best are as good as any I've ever seen. And I pray that we will continue to expand the scope of the knowledge of lawyers. I had to take a course called Basic Accounting for Lawyers at Harvard. I'd never had any accounting. I didn't know beans. And now they won't let you out of law school in most places unless you do know some accounting. And if you're going to be an economic lawyer at all, a business lawyer, you've got to know how to talk economics. Basically, you've got to be able to get your head inside your client's head and the other side's heads to see what the party's real interests are and help them to achieve those that don't destroy the other guy. So I'm optimistic. I'm not pessimistic about the law or about the legal system in the United States. For all of our warts, the United States and England and France have wonderfully functioning legal systems which are transparent. Unless you have transparency and honest judges, society simply cannot progress.
Do you have any words of wisdom you want to pass on to younger lawyers?
It would be an arrogance to call them words of wisdom, but my advice to young lawyers would be, when you have legal work to do, work hard, focus on it, do it well. Crucial is if you're into something you don't know anything about, ask somebody or refer the client to someone who does know. It's a terrible sin for a lawyer to educate himself at the client's expense. It doesn't help the client, and the lawyer ends up very anxious. So I would say that in terms of practicing law, study hard, work hard, keep honest track of your time. Don't be like some lawyers who work 9 to 5 and bill $2,000 a year. And don't be focused on the bloody billable hours. I think that they're a snare and a delusion. It's how you keep track of your inventory. All billing should be value-based. It must be value-based because your job is to help your client achieve a client's goals. So that advising young lawyers, I would say make sure that you are charging a reasonable amount for services actually performed and that your focus at all times is what's in your client's best interest. And if that means that you send the client down the road because you don't know how to do it, you'll save a friend and probably a client by putting them in the hands of someone who knows what they're doing. And particularly for young lawyers, I would say get involved in your community. One of the problems with all the big firms, and I've seen that in the years I was at Miller Stratford, they think they're so busy trying negligence case, whatever the hell it is, that they don't have time to get involved. Well, we are blessed with talents that our legal skills keep us, and we have an obligation to get involved, not just in Little League or PTA or whatever, but look around, I would say to young lawyer, look around the community, see something that grabs your heart, and then get involved. People love our skills when we're willing to give them. So it's been a real treat. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Appreciate it.
I hope I didn't break your camera.